The advance of the Allied armies across Europe in 1944 and 1945 was more than a military campaign. It was a journey into the darkest heart of human cruelty. As these forces, American, British, Soviet, and others, pushed back the borders of Nazi Germany, they did not only encounter soldiers and fortifications. They stumbled upon a hidden world of barbed wire and despair, a system of oppression and extermination that defied all previous understanding of warfare and humanity. They found the concentration camps. The unspeakable conditions that these liberators confronted, often wholly unprepared for the horrors that lay behind the gates, would shed a blinding, terrible light on the full scope of the Nazi regime's crimes. The year 2025 marks the 80th anniversary of this liberation, a solemn remembrance of the moment the prisoners of these camps were freed and the Nazi tyranny in Europe was finally brought to an end. This is the story of those liberations, a chronicle of discovery, shock, and the painful dawn of a new reality for the world. The first of these monstrous facilities to be uncovered was not in the heart of Germany, but in Poland. It was the Majdanek camp, located near the city of Lublin. In the summer of 1944, as Soviet forces advanced relentlessly westward in their massive offensive against the German army, they approached this significant Nazi stronghold. The previous spring, the SS, anticipating the Soviet advance, had evacuated a majority of the Majdanek prisoners and a large portion of the camp personnel. These evacuated prisoners were not released, they were merely transferred deeper into the Reich's dwindling territory, sent to other camps like Gross-Rosen, Auschwitz, and Mauthausen, where their suffering would continue. As the Soviet troops drew near at the end of July, the remaining camp personnel at Majdanek, gripped by panic and haste, abandoned the concentration camp without fully dismantling it or destroying all the evidence of the atrocities committed there. This was a critical error, one that would provide the world with one of its first, stark glimpses into the industrialized nature of the Holocaust. Soviet troops first arrived at the periphery of Majdanek during the night of July 22nd and 23rd, capturing the city of Lublin itself on July 24, 1944. When they entered the camp, they found it captured virtually intact. This was unprecedented. Unlike later camps that would be found in a state of chaotic evacuation, Majdanek stood as a chillingly preserved monument to Nazi crimes. The Soviet soldiers encountered a small number of prisoners who had, for various reasons, not been evacuated in the spring. These were mostly Soviet prisoners of war, left behind in the scramble. But more haunting than the living were the silent witnesses they found. The liberators encountered substantial, undeniable evidence of the mass murder that had been committed at Majdanek. The gas chambers, the crematoria, the barracks, all were there to be seen. Understanding the monumental significance of their discovery, Soviet officials immediately invited journalists to inspect the camp and the overwhelming evidence of the horrors that had occurred within its fences. It was here that some of the most iconic and harrowing photographs of the Holocaust were taken, including the images of a massive mound of victims' shoes piled high outside a warehouse. Each shoe, every single one, represented a life extinguished, a person who had walked into that camp and never walked out. This mountain of footwear was not just a collection of objects, it was a tangible, heartbreaking testament to the scale of the genocide, a silent scream of loss that would now echo around the globe. Just 6 months after the liberation of Majdanek, the Soviet Red Army would encounter the epicenter of the Nazis' final solution. On January 27, 1945, Soviet troops liberated Auschwitz. Auschwitz was not a single camp, but a vast complex of multiple facilities, including the killing center at Auschwitz-Birkenau. It was the largest and most efficient Nazi killing center and concentration camp in the entire system, a place whose name would become synonymous with the ultimate evil of the Holocaust. In the weeks and days preceding the arrival of the Soviet units, the SS camp personnel, aware of the impending Soviet advance, had forced the majority of the remaining Auschwitz prisoners to march westward, away from the front lines. These forced evacuations, conducted in the dead of winter with little to no food or shelter, would become known infamously as the death marches. Thousands of prisoners, already weakened by starvation, disease, and brutal labor, perished on these merciless treks, shot by guards if they fell behind or simply succumbing to the cold and exhaustion. When the first Soviet soldiers finally entered the sprawling, eerily quiet compound of Auschwitz, they did not find the bustling, murderous industry that had characterized the camp at its peak. Instead, they found a scene of profound devastation and fragile, lingering life. They discovered just over 6,000 emaciated prisoners who had been left behind, deemed too ill or too weak to be moved on the death marches. These were the living ghosts of Auschwitz, men and women who had endured the unimaginable and, by some miracle, had survived to see this day. They greeted the Soviet soldiers not just as military liberators, but as saviors who had pulled them back from the very brink of annihilation. The joy and relief of that moment, however, was tempered by the overwhelming evidence of death that surrounded them. As had been the case at Majdanek, there was abundant, horrifying proof of the mass murder that was the camp's primary function. The retreating Germans had destroyed most of the warehouses in the camp in an attempt to hide their crimes, but their haste meant the job was incomplete. In the warehouses that remained standing, Soviet soldiers made discoveries that laid bare the mechanical, plunder-driven nature of the Holocaust. They found the personal belongings of the victims, looted and stored on an industrial scale. Among these items were hundreds of thousands of men's suits, more than 800,000 women's garments, and a staggering collection of household goods, eyeglasses, and other personal effects. But perhaps the most chilling discovery of all was the more than 14,000 pounds of human hair, shorn from the heads of the victims before they were murdered, bundled and baled like a commercial commodity, intended for use in the German war industry. This was not the heat of battle killing of war. This was a cold, calculated, and systematic process of dehumanization and extermination, laid bare for the world to see. In the months that followed the liberation of Auschwitz, Soviet units continued their westward drive, liberating additional camps in the Baltic states and in Poland. Shortly before Germany's final unconditional surrender in May 1945, Soviet forces would liberate other major concentration camps, including Stutthof, Sachsenhausen, and Ravensbrück, the latter being the largest camp for women in the German Reich. Each liberation revealed a similar pattern: camps hastily abandoned, evidence partially destroyed, and a small remnant of desperately ill and starving prisoners left to die. Each discovery added another layer to the world's understanding of the vast, bureaucratic killing machine that the Nazis had built. While the Soviet forces were liberating camps in the east, the Western Allies, American and British troops, were advancing from the west. As these armies pushed into the heart of Germany itself, they too began to encounter the grim reality of the concentration camp system. This encounter was a direct result of a fateful order given by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler. Shortly after the Soviet capture of Majdanek in July 1944, Himmler, in a desperate attempt to prevent more prisoners from falling into Allied hands and to possibly use them as bargaining chips, ordered that prisoners in all concentration camps and subcamps in the German-occupied East be forcibly evacuated into the interior of the Reich. These evacuations became the death marches, a final, brutal chapter of suffering for hundreds of thousands. Consequently, as American and British troops launched their final offensives within Germany's borders, they encountered tens of thousands of these concentration camp prisoners, scattered in camps and subcamps across the country. Most of these prisoners were suffering from extreme starvation and rampant, contagious disease, the walking dead who had endured one of the most horrific forced migrations in history. It was in this context that American forces liberated a series of major concentration camps. On April 11, 1945, U.S. troops liberated the Buchenwald concentration camp, located near the culturally significant German city of Weimar, a place associated with Goethe and German humanism. The irony was cruel and profound. Earlier on that very day, before the arrival of the U.S. troops, an organized underground prisoner resistance movement within Buchenwald, having sensed the impending collapse, seized control of the camp to prevent last-minute atrocities by the retreating SS guards. This act of incredible courage and defiance by the prisoners themselves is a powerful, though often overlooked, part of the liberation story. When the American forces finally arrived, they were met by this prisoner-led administration and encountered more than 20,000 prisoners, all of whom had endured the brutal regime of Buchenwald. The shock experienced by these American soldiers, many of whom were battle-hardened veterans, was profound. They were simply not prepared for the skeletal figures and the piles of corpses they found. That same month of April, U.S. troops continued their grim task of liberation. They entered the Dachau concentration camp, just outside Munich, a place that had been one of the first camps established by the Nazis and which served as a model for all others. The horrors they witnessed there would leave indelible psychological scars on the liberators. They also liberated the Dora Mittelbau camp, where prisoners were worked to death in underground tunnels manufacturing V-2 rockets, and the Flossenburg camp. In early May of 1945, just days before the final German surrender, American forces liberated the Mauthausen camp complex in Austria, a place known for its brutal stone quarry and its reputation as one of the harshest camps in the system. Meanwhile, British forces were undertaking their own heartbreaking liberations in northern Germany. They freed the camps at Neuengamme and, most infamously, Bergen-Belsen. British troops entered the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in mid-April 1945. Unlike the extermination camps in Poland, Bergen-Belsen was not equipped with gas chambers, but the conditions the British soldiers discovered were nonetheless apocalyptic. The camp was in the grip of a devastating typhus epidemic, and the German authorities, in a state of collapse, had completely abandoned any pretense of order or care. The British liberators found some 55,000 prisoners alive, but the vast majority were in critical condition, ravaged by disease and starvation. The scenes were beyond comprehension. Piles of unburied corpses lay scattered throughout the camp, and the living were often too weak to move, lying amidst the dead and the human waste. The British Army, though militarily victorious, was now faced with a monumental humanitarian catastrophe. Despite immediately mobilizing medical resources and efforts to save the survivors, the toll was immense. More than 13,000 of the prisoners liberated from Bergen-Belsen died from the effects of severe malnutrition or disease within just 3 months of their liberation. Their freedom had come, but for far too many, it had come too late to save them from the physical devastation wrought by the Nazis. The impact of these successive liberations was seismic, both for the liberators themselves and for the world at large. The soldiers who entered these camps, whether American, British, Soviet, or Canadian, were confronted with unspeakable conditions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They found piles of corpses lying unburied, often in advanced states of decomposition. They encountered living prisoners who so closely resembled skeletons that it was difficult to tell the living from the dead. These survivors were the physical embodiment of years of forced labor, systematic starvation, and relentless maltreatment. Many were so weak that they could hardly move or speak. The liberators did their best to provide immediate aid, offering their own rations and medical supplies, but for many survivors, even this help was too much for their ravaged bodies to handle, and they perished in the arms of their rescuers. Disease remained an ever-present danger, a final threat from the camps even after they were liberated. Typhus, typhoid, and dysentery were rampant, and to prevent the spread of these deadly epidemics, many of the camps had to be burned down completely, a final, purging fire to destroy the pestilence that the Nazis had cultivated. Only after the liberation of these camps was the full, horrifying scope of Nazi barbarism exposed to the world in all its graphic detail. The photographs and film footage, the news reports and the soldier testimonies, all coalesced into an undeniable record of atrocity. The world could no longer look away or claim ignorance. For the survivors of the camps, liberation was not the end of their ordeal, but the beginning of a long and agonizingly difficult road to recovery. They faced the immense physical challenge of rebuilding their bodies from a state of near-total collapse. They faced the psychological trauma of having endured the unimaginable, of having lost their entire families and communities. They faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives in a world that had been utterly shattered, carrying with them the memories of a darkness that would forever mark their souls. The liberation of the Nazi camps was a moment of profound triumph over evil, but it was also the opening of a deep and lasting wound, a reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the enduring strength of the human spirit to survive against all odds. The 80th anniversary serves as a permanent call to remembrance, to education, and to vigilance, ensuring that the stories of the victims, the survivors, and their liberators are never, ever forgotten.